They wanted her gone. She refused to disappear. In a town where women bent or broke, Eliza Crow did neither, and for that, they decided she had to vanish. When Red Hollow's powerful men couldn't silence her, they hired someone who could, a tracker feared across 3 territories, a man who'd never failed to deliver. But the moment Kyle Varick laid eyes on her, he made a choice that would set the frontier ablaze. This is a story of defiance, survival, and 2 outcasts who burned down the world that tried to erase them. Stay until the end. Like this video and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The wind came down from the mountains like a living thing that morning, cold and sharp enough to draw blood. It rattled through Red Hollow's crooked streets, pulling dust from between the wooden slats of half-abandoned buildings, whispering through the skeletal remains of what had once been a prosperous mining town. The silver was gone now, pulled from the earth until there was nothing left but empty tunnels and emptier promises. Eliza Crow stood in front of her father's house, her house now, though the bank would argue otherwise, and watched the town watch her. They always watched. From behind lace curtains and over the tops of newspapers, from the doorways of the general store and the shadows of the saloon, Red Hollow kept its eyes on Eliza Crow the way a wolf pack watches a wounded deer, waiting, calculating, wondering when she'd finally stumble. She was 23 years old, tall and lean from years of hard work. With dark hair she kept pulled back in a severe braid and eyes the color of slate before a storm. Her mother had died bringing her into the world, leaving her to be raised by Marcus Crow, a man who'd loved her fiercely and taught her to stand straight even when the wind tried to push her down. He'd been dead 3 weeks now. 3 weeks since the cave-in at the old Winchester mine, since they'd pulled his broken body from the rubble and laid him out in the undertaker's parlor. 3 weeks since Eliza had stood dry-eyed at his graveside while the town murmured their hollow condolences and counted the days until she'd be forced to leave. Because Marcus Crow had died owing money. A lot of money. The bank held the note on the house. The general store held tabs for supplies he'd bought on credit, believing the mine would pay out one more time. Even the doctor held a bill for the medicine that hadn't saved him when the fever set in after the accident. All told, her father had left behind debts that would take Eliza 10 years to pay off. If she could find work, which in Red Hollow was about as likely as finding silver in a played-out mine. Women in Red Hollow had 3 options: marry, take in washing, or leave. Eliza had rejected all 3. She'd kept the house, barricaded the door when the bank's representative came calling, and started taking odd jobs wherever she could find them, mending fences, chopping wood, anything that would earn her a few coins. The work was hard and the pay was insulting, but it was hers. Every callus on her hands, every ache in her back was proof that she could survive on her own terms. The town hated her for it. "Miss Crow." The voice cut through the wind like a blade. Eliza turned to find Mayor Silas Carr standing at the edge of her property, his considerable bulk wrapped in an expensive coat that looked ridiculous in a dying mining town. Behind him stood his son, Thomas, and 2 of the town's more disreputable citizens, men who did the kind of work that didn't appear in official records. "Mayor Carr," Eliza said, her voice flat, "if you're here about the house, the answer is still no." Silas Carr had a face like poorly tanned leather, all jowls and deep-set eyes that calculated the worth of everything they saw. He'd made his fortune not from mining but from miners, charging exorbitant rents for company housing, selling supplies at triple their value, lending money at rates that guaranteed default. When the silver ran out, he'd pivoted smoothly to land speculation, buying up properties for pennies and waiting for the railroad to make them valuable. Marcus Crow's house sat on one of the few parcels in Red Hollow with water access and flat land suitable for building. Silas wanted it badly. "I'm not here about the house, Miss Crow," Silas said, his voice oily with false courtesy. "I'm here about my son." Thomas Carr stepped forward, and Eliza's jaw tightened. Thomas was 25, soft around the middle despite his youth, with his father's calculating eyes and his mother's weak chin. He'd been pursuing Eliza since before her father died, mistaking her poverty for vulnerability and her independence for a challenge to be overcome. 2 days ago, he'd cornered her outside the general store and put his hands where they didn't belong. She'd broken his nose with the heel of her palm and walked away while he bled into the dirt. Your son put his hands on me, Eliza said coldly. I defended myself. If he has a complaint, he can take it to the sheriff. The sheriff works for me, Silas said, and his smile didn't reach his eyes. As does the judge, the banker, and just about everyone else in this town who matters. You humiliated my boy in front of half of Red Hollow. That demands an answer. He's lucky I didn't do worse. Thomas's face flushed red above the bandage across his nose. You uppity bitch! Thomas. Silas's voice was quiet, but sharp enough to silence his son immediately. He turned his attention back to Eliza, and the false courtesy dropped away like a shed skin. Here's how this is going to work, Miss Crow. You're going to apologize to my son. You're going to sign over your father's property to settle his debts, and then you're going to leave Red Hollow quietly. Do this, and I'll make sure you have enough money to start over somewhere else. Refuse. He let the word hang in the air. Well, the frontier can be dangerous for a woman alone. Eliza looked at the four men standing on her property, at the town watching from behind their windows, and felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. This was the moment they'd been waiting for. The moment when she'd finally break, finally bend, finally become what they wanted her to be. She thought of her father, who'd taught her to read from his own books when the town said education was wasted on daughters, who'd let her work beside him in the mine when other girls were learning to sew, who'd told her, on his deathbed, to be strong no matter what came. Get off my property, Eliza said quietly. Silas's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or anger, or maybe just a cold satisfaction that she'd chosen this path. Last chance, Miss Crow. I said get off my property. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Silas nodded slowly, as if she'd just confirmed something he'd suspected all along. So be it. Thomas, gentlemen, we're done here. They left without another word, but Eliza knew what that nod meant. She'd crossed a line, made an enemy of the one man in Red Hollow who could destroy her without lifting a finger. She just didn't know how right she was. But the decision was made that night in the back room of Silas Carr's house over whiskey and cigar smoke. She's becoming a problem, Silas said, swirling amber liquid in a crystal glass. Around the table sat Red Hollow's other power brokers, the banker, the sheriff, the owner of the largest remaining mining operation, and a railroad representative who'd been promised lucrative contracts once the town was cleaned up, enough to attract Eastern investment. One woman, the sheriff, a thick-necked man named Porter, laughed. Silas, just evict her. I'll back the play. It's not that simple. The banker, a nervous man named Fellows, shifted in his seat. Technically, the house is still in her name. Marcus's debts haven't been legally transferred to her, and she hasn't accepted them. If we move to evict, she could fight it in court, and that could take months, years even, if she finds the right lawyer. Well, let her starve then, the mining operator suggested. No one will hire her. No one will sell to her. Give it a few weeks and she'll leave on her own. Silas shook his head. She's too stubborn. She'll dig in, make herself a martyr, and the longer she stays, the more others might start getting ideas. We've worked too hard to establish order in this town. We can't let one defiant woman undermine it. So what are you suggesting? The railroad man asked. Silas leaned back in his chair, smoke curling from his cigar. I'm suggesting we remove her. Permanently. Quietly. The room went silent. You mean kill her? Fellows' voice was barely a whisper. I mean make her disappear, Silas corrected. There are ways. This is the frontier. Women vanish all the time. Killed by bandits, lost in the wilderness, run off with some drifter. Who's going to question it? Who's going to care? I care about not hanging for murder, Porter said flatly, which is why we're not going to do it ourselves. Silas reached into his coat and pulled out a piece of paper, worn at the edges and covered in small, precise handwriting. 3 years ago, a man came through Red Hollow, a tracker. He was hunting someone. I never learned who, but I remember him because of the stories that followed. They said he'd tracked a fugitive across 200 miles of desert without losing the trail once. They said he could find water where there was none, read signs in stone, move through country that would kill a normal man. They said he was half ghost. Trackers work, Porter said dismissively. Embellished campfire tales. Maybe. Silas slid the paper across the table. But I kept this. A way to contact him, if the need ever arose. His fee is high, but he's said to be discreet. He takes jobs that others won't, makes problems disappear without questions asked. The banker picks up the paper, studying it. You want to hire him to kill Eliza Crow? I want to hire him to take her away. What happens to her after that? Silas shrugged. Not our concern. The point is, she vanishes. No body, no evidence, no awkward questions, just another tragic story about a woman who couldn't survive on her own. The men around the table exchanged glances. What Silas was proposing crossed a line, not just legally, but morally. But then, they'd all crossed lines before. That's how power worked in places like Red Hollow. The railroad man spoke first. How much? $200. Split 5 ways. That's 40 each. Make it 6 ways, Thomas Carr said from the doorway. They all turned. Silas's son stood there, his broken nose a purple-black mess across his face, his eyes bright with something ugly and eager. Thomas, Silas began. She humiliated me, father, in front of the whole town. I want her gone as much as you do. More. Silas studied his son for a long moment, then nodded slowly. 6 ways, then. Gentlemen? One by one they agreed, the banker reluctantly, the sheriff pragmatically, the mining operator with a shrug, the railroad man with cold calculation, and Thomas Carr with a smile that made even his father uncomfortable. I'll send word tomorrow, Silas said. With any luck, this will all be over within the week. Kael Varick received the message 5 days later, delivered by a young courier who rode into his camp just after dawn and left before the coffee was even brewed. The camp was nothing more than a lean-to and a fire pit in a clearing 2 days' ride from the nearest town, but it was more permanent than anywhere Kael had lived in years. He'd been tracking a horse thief for the last 3 weeks, a job that had taken him through some of the roughest country in the territory. The thief was dead now, tried to ford a river during spring runoff and drowned before Kael could even catch up to him. The horses had been returned to their owner, the bounty collected, and now Kael was simply existing. That was the hardest part sometimes, the space between jobs. He read the letter 3 times, memorizing the details. A woman, a removal job, discretion required. $200, more than twice his usual rate, which meant the client was either desperate or the job was particularly ugly. Probably both. Kael should have said no, should have burned the letter and moved on to the next bounty, the next trail, the next thing that kept him moving and didn't require him to think too hard about what he'd become. But $200 was $200, and the frontier didn't offer many opportunities to turn down that kind of money. He broke camp within the hour. Kael Varick was 32 years old and had been alone for most of them. He'd been born in a Missouri settlement to parents whose faces he could no longer remember clearly. His father had died when Kael was 6, killed by a falling tree while clearing land. His mother had remarried a year later, to a man who didn't want another man's child underfoot. At 8, Kael had been apprenticed to a trapper, a grizzled old Frenchman named Baptiste, who taught him to read sign, set snares, and survive in country that killed softer men. Baptiste died when Kael was 14, frozen to death during a late-season blizzard. Kael had buried him under stones and kept moving, because that's what Baptiste would have done. For the next 18 years, Kael had drifted through the territories, taking work where he could find it. He'd been a scout for wagon trains, a guide for hunting parties, a courier for people who needed messages delivered through hostile country. Eventually, he'd fallen into tracking work, finding lost children, runaway wives, fugitives from justice. He was good at it, better than good. He could read a trail the way other men read newspapers, could extrapolate patterns from broken twigs and disturbed soil, could move through wilderness with a silence that seemed supernatural to those who didn't understand that it was just discipline and practice. The stories that followed him, half ghost, more myth than man, were useful. They made negotiations easier, made targets give up faster, made clients pay without argument. Kael didn't discourage them, but they also isolated him. People feared what they didn't understand, and Kael had long since stopped trying to make them understand. He traveled light. A good horse, a rangy buckskin gelding with a mean streak and more endurance than any animal had a right to possess. A Winchester rifle, a Colt revolver, a bedroll, a canteen, and supplies for 2 weeks in the field. Everything he owned fit in a pair of saddlebags and a worn leather pack. It took him 4 days to reach Red Hollow, riding through country that grew progressively more desolate as the mines played out. He saw abandoned camps, rusted equipment, the skeletal frames of buildings half built and then forgotten when the money ran out. The land itself seemed exhausted, as if too much had been taken from it and nothing given back. He rode into Red Hollow just before sunset, when the light turned everything the color of dried blood. The town was exactly what he'd expected. A main street lined with buildings in various states of decay, a few businesses still clinging to life, and an atmosphere of slow collapse. People stopped to stare as he passed, their eyes tracking him with the wary calculation of prey animals deciding whether to run. Kyle ignored them. He'd been stared at before. The mayor's house was easy to find, the largest building in town, freshly painted, with glass windows and a wrought iron fence that separated it from the surrounding squalor like a declaration of superiority. Kyle tied his horse outside and knocked once, hard enough to be heard, but not hard enough to be threatening. The door opened to reveal a soft-bodied man in his mid-50s, expensive clothes, calculating eyes. Silas Carr, Kyle presumed. "Mr. Varick," Silas said, ushering him inside quickly. "Thank you for coming so quickly." "You paid for speed." Kyle's voice was rough from disuse, low and flat. "Let's talk business." They went to a study lined with books that had probably never been read, and Silas poured whiskey into cut crystal glasses. Kyle accepted his but didn't drink. He listened while Silas explained the situation. A difficult woman, a threat to the town's stability, a need for discretion. "I don't want her killed," Silas said carefully. "Just removed, taken somewhere far enough away that she can't come back. What happens after that is between you and her." Translation. Silas didn't care if Kale killed her, as long as it couldn't be traced back to Red Hollow's leadership. "Why me?" Kale asked. "Because you're good at making problems disappear, and because you don't ask questions." Kyle studied the mayor. He'd met men like Silas before, men who'd built power through careful cruelty, who justified their actions with economics and order while sleeping soundly in expensive beds. Part of Kale wanted to walk away, to tell Silas to solve his own problems. But $200 was $200. "I'll need to see her first," Kale said. "Assess the situation." Silas's smile was oily with satisfaction. "Of course. I'll have someone show you to her property in the morning. In the meantime, I've arranged a room at the boarding house." Kale stood. "I'll find my own accommodations." He left before Silas could respond, stepping out into the gathering dark. The town felt wrong somehow, like a place where too many bad decisions had been made and the weight of them was finally becoming too much to bear. Kale made camp outside of town, under the stars, and tried not to think about what he'd agreed to do. He saw Eliza Crow for the first time the next morning. She was chopping wood in front of a small, weathered house at the edge of town, and the first thing Kyle noticed was her form. Efficient, controlled, no wasted motion. She brought the axe down in a clean arc, splitting the log perfectly, then bent to stack the pieces without pausing. Her dark hair was pulled back, her simple dress covered by a man's work shirt that had probably belonged to her father, and her hands were wrapped in strips of cloth to protect against blisters. She worked like someone who'd done this before. A lot. Kale watched from the shadow of a nearby building, studying her the way he'd study any target, looking for weaknesses, patterns, vulnerabilities. What he saw instead was strength held in check by sheer will. This was a woman who'd been pushed to the edge and had decided the edge was where she'd make her stand. "Seen enough?" Eliza's voice cut across the yard without her looking up. "Or were you planning to stand there staring all morning?" Kale stepped into the open. "How'd you know I was there?" "Your shadow." She finally looked at him, and her eyes were exactly what he'd expected, storm gray and completely unafraid. "You're the tracker they hired." It wasn't a question. "How'd you know that?" Kyle asked. "Because Red Hollow doesn't get many strangers, and the ones we do get don't skulk around watching people chop wood." She set the axe down carefully, within easy reach. "So, are you here to kill me or just drag me off to die somewhere else?" Her directness caught him off guard. Most people, faced with someone like Kyle, either became defensive or tried to bargain. Eliza Crow just stated the facts as she understood them and waited for confirmation. "Haven't decided yet," Kyle said honestly. Something that might have been respect flickered across her face. "Well, at least you're honest about it." She picked up the axe again and turned back to her work. You want to kill me, you're going to have to work for it. Fair warning, I don't plan to make it easy. Didn't expect you would. Eliza brought the axe down, splitting another log. So what now? You going to shoot me in the back while I work? Poison my well? Burn the house down around me while I sleep? No. Then what? Cale didn't answer. He was trying to reconcile what Silas had told him. A difficult woman, a troublemaker, someone who needed to be removed for the good of the town, with the reality in front of him. This wasn't some rabble-rouser or criminal. This was someone trying to survive against a system designed to crush anyone who didn't comply. They told you I was dangerous, Eliza said, still not looking at him. Probably said I was crazy. Definitely said I was trouble. What they didn't tell you is that my only crime was saying no. She paused, the axe held above her head. My father died owing money to half this town. They want his property. I won't give it to them, so they hired you. That about covers it, Kyle agreed. And you took the job. I did. Eliza brought the axe down so hard the sound echoed off the surrounding buildings. When she turned to face him, her expression was cold fury barely held in check. Then you're just like them. Another man who thinks women are problems to be solved instead of people to be heard. The words hit harder than they should have, maybe because there was truth in them. How many jobs had Kyle taken without asking questions? How many problems had he helped powerful men solve without wondering whether the problem might actually be the men? Maybe, Kale said quietly, but I'm here now, and I'm listening. Eliza laughed, but there was no humor in it. What's there to listen to? You know the story. Poor woman loses her father, can't pay his debts. Town decides she needs to go. It's the same story that's played out 1,000 times in 1,000 towns, just like this one. The only difference is, this time the woman won't cooperate. Why not? Why not? Eliza's voice rose. Because this is my home, because my father built this house with his own hands, because I'm tired of being told that my only value is in being quiet and obedient and grateful for whatever scraps men decide to throw my way. She took a step toward him, the axe still in her hands. You want to take me away? Fine. But you're going to have to carry my corpse, because I'm not leaving here alive unless it's by my own choice. They stood facing each other across the dusty yard, and Kyle made a decision that would change both of their lives. Then I guess I'll have to give you a choice, he said. Desk. The plan came to him fully formed, audacious, and probably insane, but the more he thought about it, the more sense it made. Marry me, Kale said. Eliza stared at him like he'd grown a second head. What? Marry me. Right now. Today. Are you insane? Probably. Cale took a step closer, keeping his hands visible and non-threatening. But think about it. You're unmarried, unprotected, with no legal claim to anyone's support. That makes you vulnerable. But a married woman has legal protections. Her husband's property becomes hers. His debts can't be transferred to her. And most importantly, he met her eyes. No one can legally remove you from your home without going through him. Eliza's grip on the axe loosened slightly as she processed what he was saying. You'd marry me to protect me from the people who hired you? I'd marry you to give you leverage and to keep you alive, which, Cale shrugged, seems like the better outcome than whatever Silas Carr has planned. Why? The question was sharp, suspicious. Why would you help me? Cale thought about all the jobs he'd taken, all the problems he'd solved for men like Silas Carr, all the times he'd looked away because it was easier than asking questions. Maybe he was tired. Maybe he'd finally found a line he wasn't willing to cross. Or maybe he just looked at Eliza Crow, standing defiant in a town that wanted her gone, refusing to break even when breaking would be easier, and saw something worth protecting. Because you're not a problem that needs solving, Kyle said simply. You're a person who deserves better than this. Eliza was quiet for a long moment. Then, if I say yes, if I actually agree to this insane plan, what happens next? We get married. Immediately. Then I take you out of Red Hollow before Silas and his friends realize what we've done. By the time they figure it out, you'll be legally protected and too far away for them to reach easily. And then? Then we figure it out. Find somewhere safer, somewhere you can actually build a life. With you. It wasn't a question, but Kyle answered anyway. If that's what you want, or I can leave once you're settled. Your choice. Eliza looked at him, really looked, as if trying to read his intentions from the set of his shoulders and the way he held himself. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her, because she finally nodded. All right, she said. Let's do it. Chum. They were married an hour later in front of Red Hollow's Justice of the Peace, a nervous little man named Whitmore, who performed the ceremony with shaking hands and kept glancing toward the door as if expecting Silas Carr to burst in at any moment. Cale had paid him double his usual fee to keep quiet about it for 24 hours. It wouldn't buy them much time, but it would be enough. The ceremony was brief and joyless. Eliza wore the same work dress she'd been chopping wood in. Cale didn't remove his gun. They exchanged no rings, no tender words, no promises beyond the legal minimum. When Whitmore pronounced them married, Eliza didn't flinch and Cale didn't smile. It was a transaction, nothing more. A legal shield against men who'd learned to weaponize the law. I need to pack, Eliza said as they left Whitmore's office. Be quick, we leave in an hour. She was ready in 40 minutes. Everything she owned fit in a single worn trunk, clothes, a few books, her father's pocket watch, and a small wooden box she didn't open. Kyle loaded it onto his pack horse without comment, then helped her mount the buckskin gelding. Ever ridden before? He asked. Only twice. Both times ended badly. Then hold on tight and trust the horse. They rode out of Red Hollow as the sun reached its apex, turning the dusty street into a river of gold. People stopped to watch them go, the strange tracker and the woman the town wanted gone, but no one tried to stop them. Not yet. That would come later, Kyle knew. When Silas discovered what had happened, there would be anger. Maybe violence, but by then they'd be far enough away that it wouldn't matter. At least, that's what he told himself. They rode for the rest of the day, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and Red Hollow. Eliza didn't complain, even when Kyle could see she was exhausted, her hands cramping from gripping the saddle horn so tightly. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson, Kyle finally called a halt near a small creek with good water and grazing for the horses. We'll camp here, he said, swinging down from his own horse. Eliza dismounted less gracefully, her legs nearly giving out when her feet hit the ground. She caught herself against the horse's shoulder, breathing hard. You did good, Kyle said, and meant it. I feel like I've been beaten with sticks. You'll feel worse tomorrow, but it gets easier. They made camp in silence, Kyle with the efficient movements of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. Eliza trying to help, but mostly just staying out of the way. He built a small fire, more for comfort than warmth, and set coffee to boil while Eliza sat on a fallen log and stared into the flames. What happens now, she asked finally. Now we keep moving. Put more distance between us and Red Hollow. Find somewhere you can settle. And you? Kyle poured coffee into 2 tin cups, handed her one. Like I said before, your choice. I can stay or I can go. Eliza wrapped her hands around the cup, absorbing its warmth. We're married now, legally. That means something, doesn't it? It means you have legal protections you didn't have before. It means Silas can't just take your property or your freedom. Beyond that, Cale shrugged. It means whatever we decide it means. What do you want it to mean? The question caught him off guard. No one had asked Kyle what he wanted in longer than he could remember. His life was built around other people's needs, tracking what they wanted found, solving what they wanted solved, disappearing what they wanted disappeared. I don't know, he admitted. Eliza smiled slightly, and it transformed her face from severe to something almost gentle. Well, that makes 2 of us. They drank their coffee in silence, and overhead the stars began to appear, cold and distant and infinite. Somewhere behind them, Red Hollow was discovering what had happened. Somewhere ahead, the frontier waited with all its dangers and possibilities. And here, between the past and the future, 2 strangers sat by a fire and tried to figure out what they'd just done. Morning came with frost on the ground and pain in every muscle Eliza didn't know she had. She woke to find Kyle already up, the fire rebuilt and coffee brewing, his bedroll already packed and tied to his saddle. He moved through the morning routine with the silent efficiency of someone who'd spent years alone, needing no one and expecting nothing. Eliza sat up slowly, biting back a groan. Every part of her that had touched the saddle yesterday now screamed in protest. Here. Cale appeared beside her, holding out a tin cup. Drink this. It'll help. The coffee was strong enough to strip paint and tasted faintly of the creek water he'd used to make it, but the heat spreading through her chest was worth the bitterness. Eliza wrapped both hands around the cup and studied the man she'd married less than 24 hours ago. In daylight, without the dust and drama of Red Hollow surrounding them, Kyle Varick looked older than she'd first thought. Not in his face, which was weathered but unlined, but in his eyes. They were the pale blue of winter ice, and they carried the kind of weariness that came from seeing too much and caring about too little. How far did we come yesterday? She asked. Maybe 20 miles? Not enough. He was checking the horses, running his hands down their legs, examining their hooves with the careful attention of someone who knew that out here, a lame horse could mean death. We need to cover 40 today if we can. Get into country where Red Hollow's reach doesn't extend. You think they'll come after us? Cale's hands paused on the buckskin's foreleg. I know they will. Question is when and how many. Eliza drained the last of her coffee. Her whole body protested the idea of climbing back into that saddle, but she pushed herself to her feet anyway. Then we'd better get moving. Something flickered across Kyle's face. Surprise, maybe, or approval. But it was gone before she could identify it. He simply nodded and went back to preparing the horses. They rode out as the sun broke over the eastern mountains, turning the frost-covered grass into a field of diamonds. Eliza's body adjusted slowly to the rhythm of the horse, finding the small mercies in shifting her weight and loosening her grip. Kale rode ahead, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, reading the land the way other men read books. You do this a lot? Eliza asked after an hour of silence. Run away with women in the middle of the night? The corner of Kyle's mouth twitched. It might have been a smile. First time, actually. I'm flattered. You should be. I'm usually better at following orders. What changed? Cale was quiet for so long that Eliza thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, you did. Standing there with that axe, ready to die rather than give up what was yours. Most people I track, they run. Or they beg. Or they try to bargain. You just stood your ground. Didn't have anywhere left to run to, Eliza said quietly. No, but you could have left Red Hollow weeks ago, taken whatever money you had and started over somewhere else. Instead, you stayed and fought a fight you couldn't win. He glanced back at her. That takes either courage or stubbornness. Haven't figured out which yet. Maybe both. Yeah, maybe both. They rode in silence after that, the horses' hooves crunching through the frost-brittled grass. The land here was different from Red Hollow, wilder, less touched by human hands. Trees appeared in clusters, then forests, their branches still bare from winter but showing the first hints of green. Creeks ran clear and cold, fed by snowmelt from the distant peaks. It was beautiful in a harsh, indifferent way, like a painting that didn't care whether anyone looked at it. Around midday, Kyle called a halt near a stand of pines. He helped Eliza dismount, her legs nearly buckled again, and set about checking their back trail while she stretched muscles that felt like they'd been beaten with hammers. See anything? She asked when he returned. Not yet, but they're coming. He pulled dried meat and hard biscuits from his pack, handed half to her. Probably left Red Hollow this morning, soon as they figured out what happened. If they're smart, they sent at least 3 men, maybe more. Eliza accepted the food, though her stomach was too knotted with anxiety to feel hungry. How long before they catch up? Depends on how well they can track. If they're just following the obvious trail, we've got a day, maybe 2. If they're good, he shrugged. Could be tonight. And if they catch us? Kyle's expression was flat, unreadable. They won't. There was something in his voice, not bravado, not even confidence, just a simple statement of fact that made Eliza believe him. Whatever else Kyle Varick might be, he was someone who knew how to survive. They ate quickly and remounted. Eliza's body had stiffened during the brief rest, and climbing back into the saddle was agony. She must have made some sound because Kyle turned in his saddle to look at her. It'll get easier, he said. Another few days and you won't even notice. Will I live that long? If you can keep up, it wasn't a challenge, just another statement of fact. Out here, weakness meant death. Sympathy was a luxury neither of them could afford. Eliza straightened her spine and gathered the reins. Then I'll keep up. She did, though it cost her. Every hour in the saddle added new layers of pain to the existing aches, until her entire world narrowed to the horse's rhythm and the effort of not falling off. Kael pushed them hard, stopping only to water the horses and let them graze briefly before pressing on. The sun was sinking toward the western horizon when Kael finally called a halt near a rocky outcropping that offered shelter on three sides and a clear view of their back trail. Eliza slid from the saddle, and her legs gave out completely, dropping her into an undignified heap in the dirt. Kael was beside her in an instant, his hand on her shoulder. You hurt? Just everything. Eliza pushed herself up to sitting, hating how weak she sounded. I'm fine. Just need a minute. Take it. He moved away to tend the horses, giving her the privacy to collect herself. By the time Eliza trusted her legs enough to stand, Kael had the horses unsaddled and picketed, a small fire going, and water heating for coffee. He moved with the same quiet efficiency as the night before, making camp look effortless. You learn all this from your tracker work? Eliza asked, lowering herself carefully onto a flat rock near the fire. Learned it from living? Kael handed her a cup of coffee. My mentor, Baptiste, used to say that comfort is the enemy of survival. The more you need to be comfortable, the faster the wilderness will kill you. Sounds like a cheerful man. He was practical, kept me alive long enough to learn how to keep myself alive. Eliza sipped her coffee and studied Kael across the fire. You always been alone? Mostly? You? Had my father until 3 weeks ago. Before that, it was just the two of us. My mother died when I was born. Eliza stared into the flames. Sometimes I wonder if that's why he never remarried. Couldn't bear to risk losing someone else. Or maybe he just loved her that much. The gentleness in Kael's voice surprised her. She looked up to find him watching her with something that might have been understanding in those winter-pale eyes. Did you ever... She paused, unsure if she had the right to ask. Was there ever someone for you? Kael was quiet for a long time, then, once. Long time ago, didn't work out. What happened? She wanted roots, stability, a house with a garden, and children who'd grow up knowing their neighbors' names. He poked at the fire with a stick. I couldn't give her that, couldn't even promise to try. So she married someone who could, and I moved on. Do you regret it? Sometimes. Mostly I just wonder if I'm even capable of that kind of life anymore. Been alone so long, I'm not sure I'd know how to be anything else. Eliza understood that. The loneliness of Red Hollow, even before her father died. The isolation of being different, of refusing to conform, of standing apart from a community that had already decided you didn't belong. It was a different kind of solitude than Kael's, but it was solitude nonetheless. What about you? Kael asked. Ever been close to marrying? Before yesterday, I mean. Thomas Carr proposed twice. Before his father hired you to kill me, obviously. Eliza's laugh was bitter. He thought I'd be grateful. Poor orphan girl, no prospects, should be thrilled to marry the mayor's son. When I said no, he couldn't understand it. Couldn't fathom that I'd rather be alone than be owned. That why you broke his nose? That was because he put his hands on me without permission. The refusal was just good sense. Kael smiled. An actual smile this time, brief but genuine. Wish I could have seen that. It was satisfying, Eliza admitted, right up until I realized it was going to get me killed. Not killed, just married to a stranger and running for your life across hostile territory. Much better. They smiled at each other across the fire, and for a moment the exhaustion and fear and uncertainty faded into something almost companionable. Then Kael's expression shifted, his eyes focusing on something past Eliza's shoulder. Don't move, he said quietly. Every muscle in Eliza's body locked. What is it? Ryder, maybe 200 yards back, watching us. From Red Hollow? Don't know yet. Could be a drifter, could be a scout. Kael's hand drifted toward his rifle, the movement so subtle Eliza almost missed it. Either way, we need to know if they're alone. What do we do? You stay here. Keep the fire going. Act natural. I'm going to circle around, see who we're dealing with. Kale stood and stretched as if he had nothing more pressing to do than work the kinks out of his back. He picked up his rifle, casually, like he was just checking it, and walked toward the horses. Once he was behind the rocky outcropping and out of sight, he disappeared. Eliza had no idea how he did it. One moment he was there, the next he'd vanished into the landscape as if he'd never existed. She was left alone by the fire, trying to look relaxed while her heart hammered against her ribs. The minutes crawled past. Eliza added wood to the fire, poured herself more coffee she didn't drink, and tried not to stare at the darkening landscape where Kyle had said the rider was watching. The sun sank lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and still Kyle didn't return. Just when she was starting to consider the possibility that something had gone wrong, she heard voices. 2 of them, one she recognized. Just saying you should have announced yourself instead of lurking in the shadows like some kind of outlaw. Kyle emerged from the darkness with another man walking slightly ahead of him, hands raised in a gesture of peace. The stranger was younger than Kyle, maybe 25, with a scraggly beard and clothes that had seen better days. He looked nervous, but not hostile. "Found him watching from that ridge," Kyle said, gesturing with his rifle. "Says he's just a prospector looking for somewhere to camp." "I am," the young man insisted. "Name's Charlie Watts. Been working a claim about 10 miles north. Saw your fire and thought I'd check if you were friendly before I rode in. Didn't mean to spook anybody." Eliza studied him. He had the look of someone who'd been living rough. Dirty hands, worn boots, the kind of lean hunger that came from too much work and not enough food. But his eyes were honest, and his hands stayed where Kyle could see them. "You always watch strangers' camps from a distance?" Eliza asked. "Only when I don't know if they're the kind who'd shoot first and ask questions later." Charlie's smile was sheepish. "These mountains, you can't be too careful. A lot of desperate people out here." Kale lowered his rifle slightly, but didn't put it away. "You see anyone else on the trail today? Riders heading this direction?" "Matter of fact, I did. 3 men, maybe 4 hours back. Looked like they were in a hurry, following a trail." Charlie's expression shifted to concern. "They friends of yours?" "No," Kale said flatly. "Well, that's unfortunate because they looked like the kind of men who'd be unpleasant if they caught up to whoever they were chasing." Charlie glanced between Kale and Eliza. "You two in some kind of trouble?" "The kind that's none of your business," Kale said. "Fair enough." Charlie lowered his hand slowly. "Look, I'm just trying to get through the season without starving or getting shot. I don't care what your story is. But if you've got men hunting you, you might want to know there's an old trapper's cabin about 5 miles west of here, built into the side of a canyon, hard to see unless you know where to look. You could hole up there, wait them out." "Why would you tell us that?" Eliza asked. Charlie shrugged. "Because I've been hunted before, know what it's like, and because—" He hesitated. "As you two don't look like bad people, just people in a bad situation. Figured I'd help if I could." Kyle and Eliza exchanged a glance. She could see him weighing the options, calculating risks. Finally, he nodded. "We appreciate the information," Kyle said. "Now I suggest you move on. Those men find you anywhere near us, they might decide you're involved." "Already thought of that." Charlie gathered his reins. "I'll head north, put some distance between us. You two, good luck. Whatever you're running from, I hope you make it." He rode off into the gathering dark, and Eliza waited until he was out of earshot before turning to Kyle. "You believe him?" "About the cabin? Maybe. About the riders? Definitely. He described them too specifically to be lying." Kyle began kicking dirt over the fire. "We need to move, now. I thought we were camping here." That was before I knew we had 3 men 4 hours behind us. He was already saddling the horses, his movements quick and precise. "If we push hard, we can reach that cabin before they catch our trail in the morning. It's our best chance." Eliza wanted to protest. Her body was screaming for rest, for a night of sleep that didn't end after 2 hours. But she could see the tension in Kyle's shoulders, the way his eyes kept scanning the darkness, and she understood that this wasn't negotiable. She stood, ignoring the protests from every muscle, and helped him pack. Within 10 minutes, they were mounted and moving through the dark, following a path only Kyle could see. The night ride was a special kind of torture. Eliza couldn't see where they were going, could only trust the horse and Kael's whispered directions when the trail narrowed or turned. Branches caught at her clothes and hair. Once they forded a creek in complete darkness, the icy water soaking through her boots and making her gasp. Through it all, Kael kept them moving. He had an uncanny ability to navigate in the dark, finding paths that seemed impossible until they were on them. Twice, he stopped, dismounted, and spent long minutes studying the ground with his hands, reading signs Eliza couldn't see. Each time he remounted without comment and adjusted their course slightly. "How much farther?" Eliza whispered after what felt like hours. "Not far. Canyon should be just ahead." The canyon appeared as a darker shadow against the dark sky, a slash in the landscape that seemed to swallow the starlight. Kael led them along its rim for maybe a quarter mile before finding a narrow path that descended into its depths. The path was barely wide enough for the horses, loose rocks sliding beneath their hooves, and Eliza's heart hammered with every step. At the bottom, Kael dismounted and helped Eliza down. "Wait here," he whispered. "Don't move. Don't make noise." He disappeared into the darkness, and Eliza stood holding both horses' reins, listening to the sound of her own breathing and the distant rustle of wind through the canyon. After several minutes that felt like hours, she saw a brief flash of light, a match, maybe, or a spark from flint. "Clear." Kael's voice came from the darkness. "Bring the horses." Eliza led them forward carefully, following the sound of his voice. The cabin materialized out of the shadows, a low structure built directly into the canyon wall, its roof covered in dirt and fallen rocks, making it nearly invisible from above. The door hung crooked on leather hinges, and the single window was boarded up with weathered planks. Inside, the cabin was small and damp, but blessedly dry. Kael had managed to get a small fire going in the stone fireplace, enough to see by without creating smoke that would be visible from above. There was a rough table, 2 chairs missing legs, and a sleeping platform covered in moldy straw. "Home sweet home," Eliza muttered. "It's shelter. It's hidden. That's all we need." Kael brought the horses inside. The cabin was just large enough, and began unsaddling them. "We'll stay here tomorrow. Let them pass by. Then head out tomorrow night." "You think they'll pass by?" "If we're lucky. If we're not." He didn't finish the sentence. Eliza helped him with the horses, then collapsed onto the sleeping platform. The straw was damp and smelled of mildew, but she was too exhausted to care. Kael settled near the fire, his rifle across his knees, keeping watch. "You should sleep," Eliza said. "You've been awake as long as I have." "I'll sleep when we're safe." "When will that be?" Kael's smile was grim. "I'll let you know when I figure it out." Eliza closed her eyes, but sleep was elusive. Every sound made her tense: the crack of the fire, the horses shifting, the wind moaning through the canyon. She kept seeing riders in her mind, imagining them getting closer, finding the cabin, bursting through the door. "Kael?" she whispered. "Yeah?" "When you married me, did you know it would come to this? Running, hiding, looking over our shoulders? I knew it wouldn't be easy." "That's not an answer." Kael was quiet for a moment. "I knew that men like Silas Carr don't let things go. I knew they'd come after us. What I didn't know was whether we'd be fast enough, smart enough, or lucky enough to stay ahead of them." He adjusted his grip on the rifle. "Still don't know that, if I'm being honest." "So why did you do it?" "Because leaving you there would have been easier, and I'm tired of doing the easy thing." Eliza turned those words over in her mind, trying to understand what he meant. Before she could ask, exhaustion finally pulled her under, dragging her into a sleep haunted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. She woke to find pale morning light filtering through gaps in the boarded window, and Kael gone. Panic spiked through her until she heard voices outside, low, careful, too distant to make out words. Eliza crept to the window and peered through a crack between the boards. 3 men on horseback were picking their way along the canyon rim maybe 100 yards away. Even from this distance, she recognized Thomas Carr's soft profile and his father's hired thugs flanking him. They'd found the trail. The cabin door opened silently, and Kael slipped inside, his finger to his lips. He moved to the window beside her and watched the riders with the intense focus of a predator tracking prey. "They're following our tracks from last night," he breathed, barely louder than the wind. "But they lost the trail at the canyon rim. They're guessing now. Will they find us? Not if they're smart. This cabin's invisible unless you know exactly where to look, and that path we took down is nearly impossible to spot in daylight. He watched as the riders conferred, gesturing toward different parts of the canyon. They'll argue about which way we went. Eventually they'll pick a direction and move on. And if they pick this direction, Kael's hand tightened on his rifle. Then we find out how good they are in a fight. They stood in silence, watching the men debate their next move. Thomas kept pointing toward the east, away from the cabin, while one of the other men argued for searching the canyon itself. The argument stretched on for minutes that felt like hours, and Eliza barely dared to breathe. Finally, Thomas seemed to win the argument. The three riders turned their horses east and began picking their way along the canyon rim, moving away from the hidden cabin. Eliza felt the tension drain from her shoulders. "Don't relax yet," Kael warned. "They might double back. We stay quiet and still until nightfall. No fire, no movement they could spot from above." The day passed with agonizing slowness. They took turns watching through the window crack, tracking the riders' progress as they searched farther and farther east. By noon, they disappeared from sight completely, but Kael remained vigilant, refusing to let either of them leave the cabin or make unnecessary noise. Eliza used the time to clean their supplies, check the horses, and try not to think about what would have happened if Thomas and his men had found them. She kept replaying the scene at her house, Thomas's hands on her, the satisfying crunch when she'd broken his nose, and wondered if that moment of defiance was worth dying for. Yes, she decided. Even if it all ended here, in this moldy cabin in the middle of nowhere, it was worth it. Because she'd made a choice, she'd stood her ground, and that meant something, even if no one else ever knew. As the sun began to set, Kael finally allowed himself to relax slightly. They're gone, headed east, probably thinking we're making for the territories. They won't backtrack until tomorrow at the earliest. So what do? We head west, opposite direction from where they think we're going. He began saddling the horses. There's a settlement called Millbrook about 3 days' ride from here. Small place, but they don't ask questions, and they're far enough from Red Hollow that Silas's influence doesn't reach. We can rest there, figure out our next move. Eliza helped him prepare for departure, her body protesting but no longer screaming with every movement. She was adapting, she realized, getting stronger, learning to survive in this harsh world that had once seemed impossibly foreign. They rode out as soon as it was dark enough to move unseen, climbing the treacherous path out of the canyon and heading west under a sky full of stars. The night was clear and cold, their breath steaming in the air, and Eliza found herself almost enjoying the ride despite everything. There was something freeing about moving through the darkness, leaving the hunters behind, choosing her own path. "Kael?" she said after an hour of silence. "Yeah? Thank you for all of this, for not doing what they paid you to do." He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was rough. "Don't thank me yet. We're not safe. Might never be safe long as Silas wants what you have." "I know, but still, thank you." They rode on through the night, two figures moving through the wilderness, bound by a marriage of convenience and a shared determination to survive. Behind them, Red Hollow and its corruption faded into the past. Ahead, Millbrook waited with the promise of temporary refuge. And somewhere between the two, in the dark and the cold and the uncertainty, Eliza Crow began to understand that survival wasn't just about staying alive. It was about refusing to let the world break you. It was about finding strength in the most unlikely places, even in a stranger who'd become her husband, her protector, and possibly the first person in a long time who'd seen her as something more than a problem to be solved. The night stretched on, and they rode through it together. Millbrook appeared on the third morning like a mirage shimmering in the distance, a cluster of wooden buildings huddled in a valley where two rivers met, surrounded by fields that actually looked cultivated and cared for. After days of wilderness and constant vigilance, the sight of civilization made Eliza's chest tighten with something she didn't want to name. Hope, maybe. Or just exhaustion finally catching up to her. "It's real," she said, almost to herself. "It's real," Kael confirmed. "And it's safe, or as safe as anywhere gets out here." They'd ridden through 3 nights and 2 days, stopping only when the horses needed rest or when Kael spotted signs of other travelers and steered them into hiding. Eliza had learned to sleep in the saddle, learned to read Kael's signals, the slight tensing of his shoulders that meant danger, the barely perceptible nod that meant it was safe to speak. She'd learned that silence could be a kind of conversation. The trust didn't always need words. Her body had stopped screaming and settled into a constant, manageable ache. The blisters on her hands had burst and hardened into calluses. She no longer needed help mounting or dismounting, could pack her bedroll almost as efficiently as Kyle could. The wilderness was changing her, stripping away the softness of town life and replacing it with something harder, sharper, more resilient. They rode down the gentle slope toward Millbrook as the sun climbed higher, warming the air enough that Eliza could finally feel her fingers again. The town was bigger than Red Hollow, maybe 100 buildings, with an actual main street and what looked like a church at one end and a schoolhouse at the other. People moved through the streets with purpose, not the defeated shuffle of Red Hollow's residents. "This place is thriving," Eliza observed. "Timber," Cale said, "and farming. The land here is good, the water's reliable, and they're close enough to the railroad to ship goods, but far enough from the territories that they don't get much trouble." He guided his horse toward a stable at the edge of town. "They also mind their own business. Most folks here came from somewhere else, running from something. They don't ask questions because they don't want to answer them." The stable was clean and well-maintained, run by a weathered woman in her 50s who took their horses without comment and quoted them a fair price for boarding. Cale paid her for a week in advance and arranged for their gear to be stored in the tack room. "You'll want the boarding house on Cedar Street," the woman said, her accent marking her as someone from back east. "Mrs. Chen runs it. Clean rooms, decent food, doesn't pry." She looked at Eliza with eyes that had seen too much to be shocked by anything. "You two married?" "Yes," Cale said simply. "Good. She doesn't rent to unmarried couples, doesn't rent to drunks or troublemakers either, so mind your manners." The woman turned back to the horses. "Welcome to Millbrook. Hope you find what you're looking for." The boarding house was a 2-story building painted a cheerful yellow that seemed almost aggressive in its optimism. Mrs. Chen was a tiny Chinese woman with iron-gray hair and a smile that didn't reach her sharp eyes. She looked Eliza and Kyle over with the practiced assessment of someone who'd learned to spot trouble before it walked through her door. "1 room," Kyle said. 1 week to start. $2 in advance, includes breakfast and dinner. No drinking in the rooms, no fighting, no entertaining guests after dark." Mrs. Chen held out her hand, and Kale counted out the money. "You got names?" "Mr. and Mrs. Varick," Kyle said smoothly. Something in Mrs. Chen's expression suggested she didn't believe that was their real name, but she simply nodded and handed Kale a key. "Room 6, 2nd floor, end of the hall. Quiet. Breakfast is at 7, dinner at 6. You miss it, you miss it." The room was small but clean. A bed that looked almost sinfully comfortable, a washstand with actual running water, a window that overlooked the street, and a chair that had seen better days but would hold weight. After days of sleeping on the ground or in abandoned cabins, it looked like luxury. Eliza stood in the doorway, suddenly aware that she and Kyle would be sharing this space, this bed. They'd been sleeping in shifts during the journey, never both unconscious at the same time, and always with several feet of distance between them. But this was different. This was a marriage bed, even if their marriage was nothing more than a legal shield. Cale seemed to realize it at the same moment. He set their packs down and moved to the window, putting distance between them. "I can sleep in the chair," he said quietly, "or on the floor. Whatever makes you comfortable." "But Kyle..." "We're married on paper, Eliza. Doesn't mean anything beyond that unless we both want it to." He kept his back to her, his shoulders tense. "You've been through enough. I'm not going to make assumptions." Eliza studied his silhouette against the window light. This man who'd defied his orders to protect her, who'd ridden through hostile country and kept her safe when he could have just as easily collected his fee and walked away, who'd never once touched her without permission or looked at her with anything but respect. "The bed's big enough for 2, she said. "We're both exhausted. We'll sleep better if we're actually comfortable." Kyle turned to look at her, and something complicated passed across his face. "You sure?" "I'm sure I trust you. That's more than I can say about most men." He nodded slowly. "All right, then we share. But I'm taking the side by the door. In case someone comes through?" "In case someone comes through." They spent the rest of the day exploring Millbrook, carefully and separately at first. Kale checking for any signs that Red Hollow's reach extended this far, Eliza simply trying to remember what it felt like to walk through a town without feeling watched and judged. The people here were friendly in a reserved way, nodding politely but not pressing for conversation. Eliza bought new clothes from a dry goods store, practical riding pants and shirts that the shopkeeper sold without comment. And Kyle restocked their supplies with the careful efficiency of someone who knew exactly what they'd need. They met back at the boarding house for dinner and found themselves seated at a long table with 6 other residents. A young couple who couldn't stop touching each other, an older man who read through the entire meal, 2 brothers who argued in hushed tones about lumber prices, and a woman about Eliza's age who introduced herself as Sarah and asked no questions beyond whether they'd passed the salt. Mrs. Chen served beef stew that was actually seasoned, fresh bread that was still warm, and coffee that didn't taste like creek water. Eliza ate until her stomach ached, savoring every bite, while Kyle maintained his usual vigilant silence. "You planning to stay in Millbrook?" Sarah asked conversationally. "We're just passing through?" "Haven't decided yet," Kyle said. "Well, if you're looking for work, the timber mill is always hiring. Hard work, but it pays fair." She glanced at Eliza. "And if you're handy with a needle, Mrs. Patterson at the dress shop needs help. Her arthritis is getting bad." "I'll keep that in mind," Eliza said. "Thank you." After dinner, they retreated to their room. Kyle checked the window lock, tested the strength of the door, and positioned the chair where he could grab it quickly if needed. Eliza washed her face and hands in the basin, marveling at the simple luxury of clean water and soap that actually lathered. When she turned around, Kyle was already in bed, fully clothed except for his boots, lying on top of the covers with his gun within easy reach. He'd positioned himself at the very edge of the mattress, leaving her as much space as possible. Eliza changed into a nightshirt, one of the new purchases, and climbed into bed on the other side. The mattress was soft, almost too soft after nights on the hard ground. She could feel Kyle's presence beside her, the warmth of his body, the rhythm of his breathing. "Kyle?" she said into the darkness. "Yeah?" "What happens now? We can't run forever." He was quiet for a long time. "No, we can't. But we can run long enough for Silas to lose interest, for the search to die down. Eventually they'll give up, declare you dead or disappeared, and move on to the next problem." "You really believe that?" "I believe men like Silas are practical. They don't chase lost causes indefinitely. Right now you're a problem because you're visible, because you represent defiance. But if you disappear completely, if there's no one to witness your resistance," he shifted slightly, "then you stop being worth the effort. And if you're wrong, then we keep running, or we make a stand, whichever seems less likely to get us killed." Eliza turned onto her side, facing him in the darkness. "You've thought about this a lot. It's what I do. Think about survival, calculate odds, plan for contingencies." His voice was rough. "It's easier than thinking about other things." "Like what?" "Like the fact that I've spent 15 years alone because it was easier than getting close to anyone. Like the fact that I married you to save your life, but I'm starting to realize I did it to save mine too. Like the fact that for the first time in longer than I can remember, I'm sleeping in a bed with another person and it doesn't feel wrong." The honesty in his words hit Eliza like a physical thing. She'd assumed Kyle was doing this out of some sense of duty or morality, that she was just another job that had gone sideways. But there was something raw in his voice, something vulnerable that he usually kept buried under silence and competence. "It doesn't feel wrong to me either," she said quietly. They lay in silence after that, the darkness soft around them, and Eliza realized she felt safe for the first time since her father died. Not just physically safe, though Kyle's presence certainly contributed to that, but emotionally safe, like she could be herself, sharp edges, defiance and all, and it would be okay. She fell asleep listening to Kyle's steady breathing, and for the first time in weeks, she didn't dream of being chased. They woke to the sound of shouting in the street. Kyle was on his feet instantly, gun in hand, moving to the window. Eliza sat up, heart pounding, already reaching for her boots. "What is it?" she whispered. "Fire. 3 buildings down." Kyle's voice was tense. "Looks like it started in the saloon. Half the town's out there trying to put it out." Eliza joined him at the window. Smoke billowed into the dawn sky, and people ran with buckets, forming chains to the river. The fire was big, but not out of control, not yet. It looked like they might be able to save the buildings on either side if they worked fast enough. "Should we help?" Eliza asked. Kyle shook his head. Too many people asking questions. Better to stay here, stay quiet. But staying quiet became harder when, an hour later, someone knocked on their door. Kale positioned himself behind it, gun ready, while Eliza opened it a crack. Mrs. Chen stood there, her expression grave. "There are men downstairs, 3 of them, asking about newcomers to town, specifically asking about a man and a woman who arrived in the last few days." Eliza's blood turned to ice. "What did you tell them?" "Nothing yet. Told them I'd check my records, but they're not going to leave without answers." Mrs. Chen's sharp eyes moved between Eliza and Kyle. "I don't know what you're running from, and I don't care, but those men have the look of hired guns, the kind who don't stop until they finish what they started." "Back exit?" Kyle asked. "Through the kitchen, leads to an alley that connects to the stable." Mrs. Chen held up a key. "Your horses are ready. Girl at the stable is my niece. She'll have them saddled and waiting." "Why are you helping us?" Eliza asked. Something sad flickered across Mrs. Chen's face. "Because I was you once. Long time ago, different circumstances. Someone helped me disappear. Figured it was time to pay that forward." She pressed the key into Eliza's hand. "Go, quickly. I'll tell them you checked out yesterday, headed east. That should buy you a few hours." "Thank you," Eliza said, the words inadequate for what this woman was risking. "Thank me by surviving. Now go." They grabbed their packs and moved through the boarding house like ghosts, down the back stairs and through the kitchen where a young woman, Mrs. Chen's niece, nodded them toward the back door without a word. The alley was narrow and shadowed, the morning light not yet reaching its depths. They ran, packs bouncing, boots echoing off the wooden buildings. The stable was blessedly empty except for the horses, already saddled and ready. Kale's buckskin stamped impatiently, as if sensing the urgency. They mounted quickly, efficiently, and Kale led them out the back way, through a gap in the fence that opened onto a field that sloped down toward the river. They were halfway across the field when Eliza heard the shout behind them. "There! That's them!" She risked a glance back and saw 3 riders emerging from Millbrook, charging toward them at full gallop. Thomas Carr was in the lead, his face twisted with rage even at this distance. The 2 men flanking him looked professional, dangerous, the kind of hired guns Mrs. Chen had warned them about. "Ride!" Kale shouted, and they pushed the horses hard, racing for the tree line on the far side of the river. The chase was brutal and terrifying. Eliza leaned low over her horse's neck, urging it faster, feeling the animal's muscles bunch and stretch beneath her. Behind them, the shouts grew louder, closer. A gunshot cracked across the morning air, and Eliza flinched but kept riding. They hit the river at full speed, the horses plunging into the shallow ford without breaking stride. Water sprayed up, cold and shocking, and for a moment Eliza thought she'd be thrown. But she held on, gripping with her knees, trusting the horse. On the far bank, Kyle steered them into the forest, weaving between trees, following paths that seemed impossible until they were on them. The dense canopy swallowed them, and the sounds of pursuit faded slightly. But not enough, never enough. "We can't outrun them," Eliza gasped. "The horses are already tired." "Not planning to outrun them," Kyle called back. "Planning to lose them." He led them deeper into the forest, where the trees grew so close together that riding became treacherous. Branches whipped at Eliza's face and arms. Roots threatened to trip the horses. But Kyle seemed to know exactly where he was going, turning at seemingly random intervals, doubling back, crossing streams to break their scent trail. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, he called a halt in a small clearing surrounded by thick underbrush. Both horses were heaving, sides flecked with foam. Eliza slid from the saddle on shaking legs. "Listen," Kale said quietly. They stood in silence. Eliza could hear birds, the rustle of wind through leaves, the horses' labored breathing, but no shouts, no hoofbeats, nothing to indicate pursuit. "Did we lose them?" she whispered. "For now. But they'll pick up the trail eventually. We need to keep moving." Kyle pulled a canteen from his pack and took a long drink, then handed it to Eliza. We're going to have to go deeper into the mountains. Territory most people won't follow. What about supplies? We only have a week's worth, maybe less. I know, but there's a trading post another 2 days north. Old trapper named Gideon runs it. He owes me a favor. Kael studied the forest around them. If we can make it there, we can resupply, maybe get information about where Silas's reach ends. And if we can't make it there? Kael's expression was grim. Then we figure something else out. We always do. They rested for 15 minutes, letting the horses recover, then mounted again and continued north. The forest grew darker, wilder, the paths less defined. Eliza realized they were leaving behind any pretense of civilization, moving into country that existed outside the boundaries of law and order. By nightfall, they were deep enough that even Kael seemed uncertain of the path. He called a halt in a rocky hollow that offered some protection from the wind and built a tiny fire, barely larger than a candle flame. We can't keep running like this, Eliza said, chewing on dried meat that tasted like leather. Eventually, we'll run out of places to run to. I know. So what do we do? Kael stared into the small fire, his face hard in the flickering light. We could try to negotiate. Send word to Silas, offer him something in exchange for calling off the hunt. I have nothing to offer him except the land, and I won't give him that. It's all I have left of my father. Then we keep running until they give up. And if they don't give up, then we make them give up. Kael's hand moved to his rifle. We make it too expensive, too dangerous, too much trouble. We become more trouble than we're worth. Eliza understood what he was suggesting. You mean we fight back? If it comes to that, yeah. You'd do that? Risk everything to help me fight men who aren't even your enemies? Kael looked at her across the fire, and his eyes were the cold blue of winter ice, but there was something fierce burning behind them. They became my enemies the moment they hired me to hurt you, and I don't leave things half done. Something shifted in Eliza's chest. This wasn't just about survival anymore. Somewhere along the trail, between Red Hollow and here, between being strangers and being bound by paper vows, they'd become something more. Not quite partners, not quite friends, but something that ran deeper than convenience. When we get to this trading post, she said slowly, and we resupply and plan our next move, what happens after? Assuming we survive all this, assuming Silas eventually gives up, or we find a way to make him give up, what happens to us? I don't know, Kael admitted. I've been focused on keeping us alive hour by hour. Haven't had time to think past that. But you must have thought about it. Even a little. He was quiet for so long that Eliza thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, I've thought about what it would be like. To stop running. To have a place that's mine, that I can defend and hold. To wake up in the same bed more than 2 nights in a row. He poked at the fire with a stick. Used to think I didn't want that. Too confining, too much risk of loss. But lately I've been thinking maybe I was just scared. Easier to be alone than to care about something enough that losing it would break you. And now? Now I'm still scared, but I'm more scared of spending the rest of my life running, never stopping long enough to actually live. He looked up at her. What about you? What do you want once we're through this? Eliza thought about Red Hollow. About the life she'd left behind. The constant judgment, the weight of expectations, the suffocating certainty that her choices were limited to marriage, servitude, or exile. Out here, in the wilderness, she'd found something different. Freedom, yes, but also purpose. She was learning to survive on her own terms, to make decisions based on what she wanted rather than what was expected. I want to build something, she said. Not a town, not like Red Hollow, but maybe a homestead, a place where people can come if they need help, if they're running from something, a place where you can be different, and that's okay. She smiled slightly. Probably sounds foolish. Sounds like the sanest thing I've heard in a long time. They sat in comfortable silence after that, each lost in thoughts of a future that seemed both impossible and tantalizingly close. The fire burned down to embers, and the forest grew quiet around them. Kael took first watch, and Eliza wrapped herself in her bedroll and stared up at the stars visible through the canopy. Somewhere behind them, Thomas Carr and his hired guns were probably making camp too, planning their next move, discussing how to catch their prey. Somewhere ahead, the trading post waited with supplies and information, and maybe, if they were lucky, answers. And here, in the present moment, Eliza Crow lay under the stars with a man she'd married to escape death, and found herself wondering if maybe, possibly, she was starting to care about him in ways that had nothing to do with survival. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like hope. She fell asleep to the sound of Kael moving quietly around their camp, keeping watch, keeping her safe. And for the first time since this whole ordeal began, she let herself imagine a future where running wasn't necessary, where the only thing chasing them was the possibility of something real. Morning came too soon, gray and cold, with frost on the ground and their breath steaming in the air. They broke camp quickly and rode north, pushing hard, knowing that every hour of distance could mean the difference between escape and capture. The land grew rougher, the mountains steeper, the paths more treacherous. Twice they had to dismount and lead the horses through passages too narrow for riding. Once, they heard riders in the distance and had to hide in a narrow ravine for 2 hours while the sound of hoofbeats slowly faded. By the time the trading post appeared, a squat log building with smoke rising from its chimney and a corral full of horses, Eliza was exhausted, filthy, and more determined than ever to stop running and start fighting. "Remember," Kael said as they approached, "Gideon's a friend, but he's also a businessman. He'll help us, but we'll have to pay for it. In coin or favors or information, nothing's free out here." "I'm learning that," Eliza said. They dismounted in front of the trading post, and Kael pushed open the door. The smell of wood smoke, coffee, and tobacco rolled over them in a wave. And there, sitting behind a rough wooden counter with a shotgun in easy reach, was a man who looked like he'd been carved from granite and left to weather in the elements for 50 years. "Well, well," Gideon said, his voice like gravel in a bucket. "Kael Varick, heard you were dead." "Disappointed?" Kael asked. "Nah, always preferred you alive. Dead men can't pay their debts." Gideon's eyes moved to Eliza. "And who's this?" "My wife," Kael said simply. Gideon's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. "The hell you say? Last I heard, you were allergic to commitment." "Things change." "Indeed they do." Gideon leaned back in his chair. "So, what brings you to my humble establishment? And don't say it's just to catch up on old times, because you've got the look of a man being hunted." Kael glanced at Eliza, and she nodded slightly. They were trusting Gideon with their lives now. Might as well trust him with the truth. "We need supplies," Kael said, "and information, and possibly a place to hide while we figure out how to stop running." Gideon's expression turned serious. "That kind of help doesn't come cheap." "I know. Name your price." The old trapper studied them both for a long moment. Then he smiled, showing teeth that had seen better decades. "How about you start by telling me the whole story, and then we'll discuss payment." So they did. Sitting in Gideon's trading post while the wind howled outside and the fire crackled in the hearth, Eliza and Kael told their story. All of it. From Red Hollow to the canyon to Millbrook to here. And Gideon listened without interruption, his weathered face giving nothing away. When they finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he stood, walked to a shelf, and pulled down a bottle of whiskey so old the label had faded to illegibility. "Well," he said, pouring 3 glasses, "sounds like you two have gotten yourselves into a proper mess. Lucky for you, I like proper messes. They're more interesting than the alternative." He slid glasses across the counter to them. Eliza took hers and drank, the whiskey burning all the way down but warming her from the inside out. "So," Gideon said, "let's talk about how to get you out of this mess. Or if we're smart about it, how to turn it around completely." And for the first time since leaving Red Hollow, Eliza felt something shift. Not just hope, but the beginning of a plan. Gideon refilled their glasses and settled back into his chair with the air of a man preparing to solve a puzzle he hadn't been invited to solve but would do so anyway out of sheer stubbornness. "First thing you need to understand," he said, "is that men like Silas Carr don't stop because you run far enough. They stop when the cost exceeds the benefit. Right now, chasing you costs him maybe $200 in hired guns and supplies. But if you're sitting on land that's worth 10 times that, he'll keep coming until he gets it, or you're dead." "So we make it cost more," Kael said. "Exactly, but not by fighting. Fighting's expensive and unpredictable, and it turns you into exactly what he's claiming you are, outlaws. No, what you need is leverage, something that makes going after you more dangerous than letting you go. Eliza leaned forward. What kind of leverage? Gideon's smile was sharp. Information, secrets, the kind of dirt that powerful men bury deep because exposure would destroy them. He tapped his fingers on the counter. I've been trading in these mountains for 30 years. You'd be surprised what people tell a man who's far from civilization and keeps his mouth shut. And I've heard things about Silas Carr, bad things. Like what? Eliza asked. Like the fact that the mine collapse that killed your father wasn't an accident. The Winchester mine was condemned 2 years ago, structural supports rotting, tunnels unstable. But Silas owned a share in it, and he convinced Marcus and 3 other men to work it anyway, promising them a cut of whatever silver they found. He knew it was dangerous. He just didn't care. The words hit Eliza like a physical blow. Her father's death, which she'd mourned as a terrible accident, had been preventable, had been the result of one man's greed and another man's desperation. You're saying Silas killed my father. I'm saying Silas sent your father into a death trap knowing full well what could happen. Whether that's murder or just callous negligence, I'll let you decide. Gideon pulled out a pipe and began packing it with tobacco. But here's the thing. That information is worth something, not just to you, but to the territorial marshal. See, there are laws about mine safety now, federal laws. If someone could prove Silas knowingly sent men into an unsafe mine, he'd face criminal charges, prison time, loss of all his properties. Cale straightened. You have proof? I have the original safety report, the one that condemned the mine. Silas thought he'd destroyed all the copies, but the surveyor who wrote it kept one, sold it to me for whiskey and a warm place to sleep before he moved on. Gideon lit his pipe, the sweet smell of tobacco filling the room. Been sitting on it for 2 years, waiting for the right moment to use it. Why haven't you already? Eliza demanded. If you knew my father died because of Silas's greed, because your father wasn't the only one who died in that collapse. 3 other men went down with him, and their families took Silas's hush money and left town. Nobody wanted to fight. Nobody wanted to risk what little they had left. Gideon's expression was grave. But you're different. You're already fighting, and you've got nothing left to lose. Eliza felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. Her father's death had shaped everything that followed. The debt, the town's judgment, her own desperate defiance, and all of it could have been prevented if one man hadn't valued silver more than human lives. Give me the report, she said quietly. Hold on, Kael interjected. Even with proof, going after Silas legally could take months, years. We don't have that kind of time. No, but we can use the threat of it. Gideon pulled a leather folder from beneath the counter and slid it across to them. You send word to Silas that you have this document, that unless he calls off his dogs and signs over any claim to your father's property, you'll send it to the territorial marshal. He'll have to choose between his freedom and his greed. He'll choose his freedom and send more men to kill us before we can deliver it, Eliza said. Not if you've already made copies and distributed them. Not if the marshal already knows the document exists and is waiting for an excuse to investigate. Gideon smiled around his pipe. That's where my part comes in. I have contacts, people who owe me favors. I can make sure that document gets to the right people, that Silas knows it's out of his reach. But it'll cost you. How much? Kael asked. Not money. A favor. There's a man squatting on land about 20 miles west of here. Calls himself the Colonel, though I doubt he's ever been within spitting distance of the military. He's been harassing my customers, demanding tolls for using the trail that runs past his property. I want him gone. Kael's expression hardened. You want me to kill him? I want you to convince him that staying is a bad idea. How you do that is your business. Gideon shrugged. He's got maybe 6 men with him. They're mean but not particularly skilled. Shouldn't be too hard for someone with your reputation. Eliza looked at Kael, trying to read his expression. This was exactly the kind of work he'd been doing before he met her. Hired muscle, solving problems through intimidation or violence. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the question of whether he'd slipped back into old patterns or if this was different somehow. We'll do it, Kael said finally. But we do it my way. Minimal violence. Nobody dies unless they force it. Fair enough? Gideon stood and extended his hand. We have an agreement then. You handle the colonel, I handle making sure Silas knows exactly how much trouble he's in if he keeps coming after you. They shook on it, and Eliza felt the weight of another bargain settle onto her shoulders. But this one felt different. This wasn't running. This was fighting back. This was taking control of her own fate instead of letting men like Silas dictate it. They spent the night at Gideon's trading post, sleeping in a small room he kept for travelers. It was barely larger than a closet, with a single narrow bed and a window that didn't quite close. But after days in the wilderness, it felt like luxury. Eliza lay awake long after Kael's breathing had evened out into sleep, thinking about her father, trying to remember his face, his voice, the way he'd looked at her like she was capable of anything. He'd believed in her strength right up until the end, had told her to be brave no matter what came. She wondered if he'd known, in those final moments under the collapsing mine, that his death was the result of another man's calculated risk. Wondered if he'd been angry or just resigned to the way powerful men treated everyone else as disposable. Can't sleep? Kael's voice was rough with drowsiness. Just thinking. He shifted slightly, and she felt his hand find hers in the darkness. The touch was tentative, giving her the option to pull away. She didn't. About your father? He asked. About what Gideon said. That his death wasn't random, that someone chose profit over safety, and my father paid the price. Her voice cracked slightly. I've been so focused on surviving, on fighting to keep what's mine, that I haven't had time to really grieve, to be angry, to want justice. You can want all those things and still survive. They're not mutually exclusive, aren't they? Every minute I spend grieving is a minute I'm not watching my back, not planning my next move. Kael was quiet for a moment. My mentor, Baptiste, he used to say that the wilderness doesn't care about your feelings. Doesn't matter if you're sad or angry or scared, the cold will still kill you if you don't build a fire. But he also said that humans aren't wilderness. We're more complicated. We can grieve and plan at the same time. We can be angry and still make smart decisions. The trick is not letting one consume the other. Eliza turned toward him in the darkness. You miss him, Baptiste. Every day. He was the closest thing to family I ever had. When he died, I told myself it was better to stay alone. Couldn't lose people if you never let them close. His hand tightened slightly on hers. But lately, I've been thinking that's just another kind of death. Slower, maybe, but just as final. What changed your mind? You did. Standing in front of your house with that axe, ready to die for something you believed in. Made me realize I'd spent 15 years not dying, but I hadn't been living either. Just existing in the spaces between jobs, never connecting to anything, never building anything worth defending. Eliza felt her throat tighten. Kael, I'm not saying this to make you feel obligated or to pressure you into anything. I just want you to know that marrying you, helping you, it wasn't charity. It was selfish, because for the first time in years, I felt like I was part of something that mattered. She thought about all the ways she could respond, could deflect with humor, could change the subject, could pretend she hadn't heard the vulnerability in his voice. Instead, she shifted closer, closing the distance between them until her head rested against his shoulder. I'm glad you're selfish then, she said quietly, because I can't imagine doing this with anyone else. They fell asleep like that, her head on his shoulder and his hand still holding hers. And for a few hours, the world beyond that small room ceased to exist. Morning came with Gideon banging on their door and shouting that breakfast was ready. They dressed quickly and joined him at a table near the fireplace, where he'd laid out eggs, bacon, and bread that was only slightly stale. Eat up, he said. You'll want your strength for dealing with the colonel. Tell us about him, Kael said, already in planning mode. How many men exactly? What kind of weapons? What's the layout of his camp? Gideon pulled out a piece of charcoal and began sketching on the table's surface. He's set up in an old logging camp about 20 miles west. Main building is a bunkhouse that sleeps maybe 10. There's a cookhouse, a stable, and a stockade where he keeps anyone who can't pay his tolls. Usually only holds them a day or two before releasing them, but it's still illegal as hell. 6 men, you said? 6 that I've seen. Could be more. Gideon added details to his rough map. They're armed but undisciplined, spend most of their time drinking and playing cards. The colonel himself is the dangerous one, ex-cavalry, knows his way around a fight. But he's also arrogant, thinks nobody will challenge him this far from civilization. And the people he's holding now? Last I heard, a family of settlers, husband, wife, 2 kids, couldn't pay the toll, so the colonel took their wagon and supplies, said they could have it back when they worked off the debt. Eliza felt anger flare hot in her chest. He's enslaving them. He's calling it indentured service, but yeah, that's what it amounts to. Gideon's expression was grim. Territorial law doesn't reach out here. The colonel knows it. That's why he's gotten away with it this long. Not anymore, Kyle said quietly. We'll leave within the hour. They gathered their supplies and set out, following Gideon's directions through country that grew progressively more rugged. The trail was barely visible in places, overgrown from lack of use, and Eliza understood why travelers would pay a toll rather than find an alternate route. This was hard country, unforgiving and dangerous, especially for families with children and wagons full of possessions. By mid-afternoon, they could smell smoke from cooking fires. Kale called a halt, and they approached on foot, leaving the horses tied in a hidden grove. He moved through the forest like a ghost, and Eliza did her best to follow his example, stepping where he stepped, avoiding branches that might crack. The logging camp appeared exactly as Gideon had described, a cluster of rough buildings in a clearing with a stockade built from sharpened logs near the main bunkhouse. Eliza could see people moving inside the compound, men lounging near the cookhouse, someone working at the stable. And in the stockade, barely visible through the gaps in the logs, she caught glimpses of movement, the family Gideon had mentioned. "How do you want to play this?" Eliza whispered. Kale studied the camp with the intense focus of a predator analyzing prey. "We wait until dark. Most of them will be drunk by then. We get the family out first, make sure they're safe. Then we deal with the colonel. And if they catch us before we can get the family out, then we adapt." They waited in the forest as the sun sank lower, watching the camp's rhythms. Men came and went from the bunkhouse. Someone started a fire in the cookhouse. As darkness fell, lanterns were lit and the sounds of drinking and gambling drifted through the trees. Eliza counted 6 men, just as Gideon had said, plus one more who emerged from the largest building, presumably the colonel himself. He was a big man, barrel-chested and imposing even at a distance, with a voice that carried across the clearing when he shouted orders at his men. He moved with the confidence of someone who'd never been seriously challenged, who believed his strength made him untouchable. "That's him," Kyle murmured. "Stay close. Stay quiet. If shooting starts, get behind cover and don't move until I tell you." They waited until the camp had settled into the comfortable chaos of men who felt safe, who weren't expecting trouble. Then Kyle moved and Eliza followed. They circled around to the stockade's backside where shadows were deepest. Kale examined the logs, found one that was slightly loose, and began working it free. The wood was old and weathered, and it came away with a soft creak that sounded impossibly loud in the darkness. A voice from inside the stockade, a woman's voice, tight with fear. "Who's there?" "Friends," Kyle whispered. "We're getting you out, but you need to stay quiet." He worked another log free, creating a gap just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. A man appeared first, thin and exhausted, eyes wide with desperate hope. Then a woman holding a small child, maybe 3 years old. Finally, another child, older, maybe 7. "Thank you," the man breathed. They said they'd keep us until we'd worked off our debt, but there's no way to work it off. Every day they add more for food, for lodging." "We know," Eliza said quietly. "There's a trading post 20 miles east. Tell them Gideon sent you. He'll make sure you're taken care of." The family didn't need to be told twice. They slipped into the forest and disappeared, and Eliza felt a small measure of satisfaction. At least they'd saved someone. "Now what?" she asked Kyle. "Now we make sure the colonel understands this is his last chance to leave peacefully." They circled back to the front of the camp, and Kale simply walked into the clearing, his rifle in hand but pointed at the ground. Eliza followed, her heart hammering, trusting that he knew what he was doing. The men around the fire saw them immediately. Shouts went up, and weapons were grabbed. Within seconds, they were surrounded by 6 armed men, all pointing guns at them. The colonel emerged from the bunkhouse, a revolver in each hand, his face flushed with anger and alcohol. "Well, well," he said, "what do we have here? Couple of thieves trying to steal my property." "Your property ran off about 5 minutes ago," Cale said calmly, "and they weren't your property to begin with. Slavery's illegal, in case you missed that particular development." The colonel's face darkened. "Those people owed me a debt. I was collecting it." "You were holding them hostage. There's a difference." "Who the hell are you to tell me what I can and can't do on my own land?" "I'm the man telling you to pack up and leave. Tonight. Don't come back." The colonel laughed, and his men joined in. "You've got some stones, I'll give you that. Walking into my camp, making demands. But you're outnumbered 6-2, and you don't look like you're in any position to be giving orders." Cale's expression didn't change. "I don't need to be in a position. I just need to be right. And I am. You leave tonight, or I make sure every lawman in 3 territories knows exactly what you've been doing out here. See how long you last when the marshals come looking." Marshals don't care about what happens in the wilderness. They care about slavery. They care about extortion. They care about men who set themselves up as petty tyrants and prey on families just trying to make a new life. Cale took a step forward, and Eliza saw several of the men shift nervously. "So here's how this is going to work. You and your men are going to gather your things. You're going to leave this camp, and you're going to find somewhere else to be a problem, because if I ever hear about you operating in this territory again, I won't come to talk. I'll come to finish it." The colonel's face had gone from red to purple. "You threatening me, boy? I'm giving you a choice. Take it while you still can." For a long moment, nobody moved. Eliza could feel the tension crackling in the air like lightning before a storm. The colonel's men were watching their leader, waiting for his signal. Eliza's hand drifted toward the knife Cale had given her, hidden in her belt. She didn't know if she could actually use it, but having it helped. Then one of the colonel's men, a younger one, barely 20, lowered his weapon. "Colonel, maybe we should listen to him. That family, they wasn't worth the trouble anyway." "Shut up, Davis." "But he's right. Marshals start poking around, asking questions." "I said shut up!" But the seed of doubt had been planted. Eliza could see it spreading through the other men, the calculations happening behind their eyes. Was the colonel worth dying for? Was this territory worth a fight with someone who walked into their camp like he owned it? Another man lowered his weapon, then another. The colonel saw his authority crumbling and made a desperate choice. He raised both revolvers, pointing one at Kyle and one at Eliza. "Nobody moves, nobody leaves. We're going to settle this right." Cale's rifle came up so fast it was almost a blur. The shot cracked across the clearing, and the revolver in the colonel's right hand exploded into pieces, shrapnel flying. The colonel screamed and dropped both weapons, clutching his bleeding hand. "Next one goes through your skull," Kyle said, his voice flat and cold. "Your choice." The fight went out of the colonel like air from a punctured bladder. He sagged, holding his mangled hand, and looked at his men with the desperate hope that they'd back him. None of them moved. "Pack your things," Cale repeated. "All of you. You've got 1 hour." They packed. Eliza watched in amazement as 6 armed men who'd been willing to shoot them minutes ago scrambled to gather their belongings, load their horses, and prepare to abandon a camp they'd probably held for months. The colonel sat on the ground, one of his men bandaging his hand, looking like he still couldn't quite believe what had happened. 50 minutes later, they rode out. The colonel went last, turning in his saddle to spit in Kale's direction. "This isn't over." "It is," Kale said. "But if you're determined to prove otherwise, I'll be easy to find. Just follow the trail of men who made the mistake of threatening my wife." The colonel rode off into the darkness, and Eliza let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. They were alone in the camp now, surrounded by the debris of hastily abandoned occupation. "That was insane," she said. "That was necessary. You could have been killed. We both could have been killed." Cale turned to look at her, and in the firelight his eyes were still that cold winter blue, but there was something else there too. Pride, maybe. Or satisfaction. "But we weren't," he said simply. "We stood our ground. We made them leave. That's what matters." Eliza thought about Red Hollow, about all the time she'd wanted to fight back but had been alone, powerless, with no one willing to stand beside her. And now here she was, in a camp they'd liberated through sheer force of will, with a man who'd risked his life because she'd asked him to. She crossed the distance between them and kissed him. It wasn't tentative or questioning. It was certain and fierce and full of all the things she'd been feeling but hadn't known how to express. Kael hesitated for just a moment, surprise maybe or uncertainty, and then his arms came around her and he kissed her back with equal intensity. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Kael's expression was stunned. "What was that for?" he asked. "For standing with me, for not running, for making me believe that maybe I'm not alone in this anymore." "You're not," Kael said. "You haven't been for a while now." They spent the night in the colonel's abandoned bunkhouse, taking turns on watch, out of habit, but both knowing the danger had passed. In the morning, they burned the stockade to the ground, making sure no one else could use it for the same purpose. Then they rode back to Gideon's trading post with news of their success. The old trapper was pleased in his gruff way, providing them with additional supplies and a detailed letter for the territorial marshal outlining Silas Carr's crimes. True to his word, he'd already sent copies of the mine safety report to 3 different authorities, ensuring that even if Silas intercepted one, the others would still reach their destinations. "Give it a week," Gideon said. "Let the news spread. Let Silas realize the walls are closing in, then send him your terms. My guess is he'll take them." "And if he doesn't?" Eliza asked. "Then you've got the law on your side for once. And trust me, that's worth more than any number of hired guns." They stayed at the trading post for 3 more days, resting and recovering while Gideon's network of contacts did its work. Word came back through traders and travelers, whispers of federal marshals asking questions in Red Hollow, of Silas Carr looking increasingly desperate, of Thomas Carr being called back from his hunt to deal with more pressing matters at home. On the 4th day, Kael drafted a letter. It was simple and direct. Eliza would relinquish all claim to her father's property in exchange for a formal pardon from any debts, a guarantee of safe passage, and a signed statement from Silas admitting the mine's unsafe conditions. The letter would be delivered by a neutral party, with clear instructions that refusal would result in the full force of federal law descending on Red Hollow. They sent it with a trader headed south and settled in to wait for the response. It came faster than expected. Less than a week later, a rider appeared at Gideon's trading post carrying a leather satchel. Inside was everything Eliza had demanded: the signed agreements, the pardon, the admission of guilt. Silas had folded completely, choosing his freedom over his greed exactly as Gideon had predicted. Eliza held the documents in her hands and felt the weight of months of fear and anger finally lift. It was over. She was free. They both were. "What now?" Kael asked quietly. Eliza looked at the man who'd saved her life, married her to protect her, and somehow become the most important person in her world. "Now we find that homestead we talked about. Build something worth defending." "Together?" "Together." They left Gideon's trading post a week later, heading west into territory that was wild and unclaimed and full of possibility. Somewhere behind them, Red Hollow was learning to live with the consequences of its corruption. Somewhere ahead, a future waited that they could shape with their own hands. And here, in the present, Eliza Crow rode beside Kael Varick through the wilderness, no longer running from something but moving toward it, toward a life built on their own terms, toward a partnership forged in fire and choice, and the simple certainty that some things were worth fighting for. The mountains rose around them, vast and indifferent and beautiful, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Eliza felt like she was home. They found the land 3 weeks later, in a valley so remote that Kael admitted he'd only heard rumors of its existence from trappers who claimed to have stumbled upon it years ago. It sat cradled between 2 mountain ridges, protected from the worst of the winter winds, with a creek that ran clear and cold even in late summer, and meadows that still held wildflowers despite the season turning toward autumn. "This is it," Eliza said, dismounting and walking into the knee-high grass. "This is where we stop running." Kael surveyed the valley with the careful eye of someone who'd learned to assess territory for both its gifts and its dangers. Good water source, defensible position, soil looks rich enough for crops, plenty of timber for building. He nodded slowly. "Yeah, this could work." They made camp that first night in the open meadow, no shelter except the stars overhead, and talked until the fire burned down to embers about what they wanted to build. Not just a cabin, though they'd need that first, but something larger. A place where people like them, people running from something, people who didn't fit into the rigid structures of towns like Red Hollow, could find refuge. A community built on choice rather than obligation, on mutual support rather than hierarchy. It's ambitious, Kale said. Maybe too ambitious. Everything we've done so far has been too ambitious. Hasn't stopped us yet. He smiled at that, the expression transforming his usually stern face into something younger, lighter. Fair point. They started building the next morning. Kyle knew construction the way he knew tracking, not from formal training, but from years of necessity and observation. He selected trees, felled them with careful precision, and taught Eliza how to strip bark and notch logs for joining. The work was brutal, leaving both of them exhausted and aching by sunset each day. But there was a satisfaction in it that Eliza had never experienced before. Every log they placed, every wall they raised, was tangible proof that they were creating something permanent. The cabin took shape slowly. 4 walls first, then a roof frame, then the careful work of sealing gaps with mud and moss to keep out the wind. They built a stone fireplace that took a week of trial and error before the chimney drew properly. They constructed a rough table and chairs from leftover timber, a sleeping platform that was more comfortable than it had any right to be, and shelves for the few possessions they'd accumulated. By the time the first snow fell, they had a home. It was small and rough and imperfect, but it was theirs, built with their own hands, on land that nobody could take from them, in a valley that existed outside the reach of men like Silas Carr. Eliza stood in the doorway on the morning after the first snowfall and felt something she hadn't felt since her father died, a sense of belonging, of having a place in the world that was hers by right of creation rather than inheritance. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Kyle said, coming to stand beside her. He was holding 2 cups of coffee, steam rising in the cold air. "It's perfect. It's isolated, it's remote, we're going to be snowed in for months once winter really hits." He handed her a cup. "But yeah, it's perfect." They spent that first winter learning how to be together in ways that went beyond survival. Learning each other's rhythms, preferences, the small intimacies of shared space. Kale was quiet in the mornings, liked to watch the sunrise with his coffee, and didn't appreciate conversation until he'd finished at least 1 cup. Eliza sang while she worked, old songs her father had taught her, and Kyle would sometimes join in with a surprisingly good baritone. They established routines, Kyle handling the heavier outdoor work, Eliza managing their supplies, and teaching herself to cook with the limited ingredients available. They took turns with other chores, neither of them assuming that certain tasks belonged to one gender or the other. The marriage that had started as a legal convenience became something real during those long winter months. Not through any single moment or declaration, but through the accumulation of small choices. The way Kyle would wrap a blanket around Eliza's shoulders when she got absorbed in reading and forgot about the cold. The way Eliza learned to read his moods, knowing when he needed silence and when he needed to talk through whatever was troubling him. The way they'd lie together at night, bodies fitting together with increasing familiarity, talking about their pasts, their fears, their hopes for what they were building. "Do you ever regret it?" Eliza asked one night, her head resting on Kyle's chest, listening to his heartbeat. "Walking away from your old life? You were good at what you did. You could have kept taking tracking jobs, making good money." "I was good at surviving," Kyle corrected. "Not the same as living. And no, I don't regret it. This..." He gestured at the cabin around them, though Eliza knew he meant something larger. "This is the first time I've felt like I'm building toward something instead of just existing between jobs. Even when it's hard, when we're snowed in and running low on supplies and you're stuck with just me for company, especially then." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "You know what I regret? All those years I spent alone because I was too afraid to risk caring about someone. That's what I regret. Not this. Never this." Spring came late to the valley, the snow reluctant to release its grip on the land, but when it finally melted, it revealed earth that was rich and ready for planting. Eliza worked the soil with tools they'd fashioned themselves, planting seeds they'd acquired from a trader who'd found their valley through word of mouth. Kyle built a chicken coop and acquired a small flock from that same trader, along with a cow that provided milk and would eventually allow them to make cheese and butter. The homestead expanded. They built a barn for storage and to shelter animals during winter. They dug a proper well. They constructed a smokehouse for preserving meat. Each structure was built better than the last as they refined their skills and learned from their mistakes. And then, in late spring, their first visitors arrived. Eliza was working in the garden when she heard the distant sound of wagon wheels. She straightened, hand instinctively going to the rifle they kept nearby, and called for Kael. He emerged from the barn, his own weapon ready, both of them watching as a covered wagon appeared at the valley entrance. The wagon stopped a respectful distance away, and a man climbed down. He was middle-aged, weathered, with a woman and 3 children visible in the wagon behind him. "Don't mean to intrude," the man called out. "We heard tell there might be a place here for folks who are willing to work. Name's Samuel Garrett. This is my family." Kael and Eliza exchanged glances. They discussed the possibility of others finding them, of their valley becoming what they'd talked about that first night, a refuge for people who needed one. But discussing it in theory was different from facing the reality of strangers asking for shelter. "How'd you hear about us?" Kael asked, not lowering his rifle. "Trader named Gideon. Said you folks were building something different out here. Said you might have space for people who don't quite fit anywhere else." Samuel's expression was cautious but hopeful. "We've been farming for 20 years, but the railroad bought up the land around us, made it impossible to stay. We're not looking for charity, just a chance to start over." Eliza looked at the family in the wagon. The wife who watched with tired eyes, the children who ranged from maybe 5 to 12. She thought about the family they'd freed from the Colonel's stockade, about all the people who got crushed under the weight of other people's greed and ambition. "We've got space," she said, making the decision, "but we all work. We all contribute, and we all get a say in how things run here. This isn't a hierarchy, it's a community." Samuel's face broke into a smile of pure relief. "That's all we're asking for, thank you both." The Garretts settled in quickly, building their own cabin on the eastern edge of the valley with help from Kael and Eliza. Samuel proved to be as skilled with farming as he'd claimed, teaching Eliza techniques that tripled their crop yield. His wife, Martha, was a gifted weaver who could create cloth from seemingly nothing. The children brought a new kind of energy to the valley, their laughter echoing off the mountains in a way that made the place feel alive. 2 months later, another family arrived. Then a single woman fleeing an arranged marriage. Then 2 brothers who'd been blacklisted from mining work after trying to organize for better conditions. Each time, Kael and Eliza assessed them carefully, listening to their stories, determining whether they'd fit into what the valley was becoming. Not everyone was accepted. They turned away a man whose story didn't quite add up, and another whose eyes held a cruelty that no amount of desperation could excuse. But most were welcomed, given space to build, integrated into the growing community. By the end of the second year, there were 15 cabins in the valley. 47 people, all of them refugees from something, all of them choosing to build something new. They established communal structures, a meeting hall where decisions were made collectively, a school where children were taught by whoever had knowledge to share, a workshop where tools were made and repaired. They created rules based on mutual respect rather than imposed authority, resolving disputes through conversation rather than violence. It wasn't perfect. There were arguments about resource allocation, personality conflicts, disagreements about how fast to expand and in which direction. But they worked through it, learning as they went, building something that felt genuinely different from the rigid hierarchical structures they'd all fled. Eliza found herself becoming something she'd never intended, a leader, though not in the traditional sense. People came to her with problems, asking for her perspective, trusting her judgment. She tried to push back at first, uncomfortable with the responsibility, but Kael pointed out that leadership didn't have to mean control. It could mean facilitating, mediating, helping people find their own solutions. "You're good at this," he said one evening as they sat outside their cabin, watching the sun set over the valley they'd built. "Bringing people together, making them feel heard. I'm just doing what I wish someone had done for me in Red Hollow. Actually listening. Actually caring about what people need instead of what benefits the powerful. That's what makes you good at it." Eliza leaned against him, comfortable in the silence that followed. 3 years had passed since they'd fled Red Hollow. 3 years of building, growing, creating something that mattered. She thought sometimes about the woman she'd been back then, angry, defiant, alone. That woman still existed inside her, but she'd been joined by someone stronger, more confident, more connected to the world around her. "Do you ever wonder what happened to them?" she asked. "Silas, Thomas, Red Hollow. Sometimes. Gideon says the town's slowly dying. Mine played out completely. Railroad went elsewhere. Most people left. Silas lost everything when the federal investigation finished. Property seized, reputation destroyed. Thomas apparently married some banker's daughter and moved east. Cale shrugged. They became irrelevant, which is probably worse for men like them than any punishment we could have inflicted. Good. They sat in silence a while longer. Then Cale said, "There's something I've been meaning to ask you." "What?" "We got married to protect you, to give you legal standing, but that was years ago now, and things are different. We're different." He turned to face her. "So I guess I'm asking, do you want to stay married? Actually married, I mean, not just on paper." Eliza smiled. "Cale Varick, are you proposing to me? Again?" "I'm asking if the first proposal still stands, or if you'd rather we dissolved it, made it official that this was just a legal arrangement that served its purpose." She kissed him, long and slow in the fading light. When she pulled back, she said, "I made vows to you in Red Hollow. They were meant as legal protection, but somewhere along the way they became real. So yes, the proposal still stands, and my answer is still yes." He produced a small object from his pocket, a ring carved from wood, simple and rough, but clearly made with care. "I've been working on this for months. Wanted to wait until it was right." Eliza slipped it onto her finger, feeling the weight of it. Not just the physical weight, but what it represented. A promise freely given, not forced by circumstance, but chosen with full knowledge of what it meant. "It's perfect," she said. The valley continued to grow. By the 5th year, they had nearly 80 residents and had established trading relationships with neighboring settlements. Their crops were successful enough to export surplus. Their livestock had multiplied. They'd built a proper road leading in and out of the valley, making travel easier while still maintaining enough remoteness to discourage casual visitors. But growth brought new challenges. Some of the newer arrivals didn't fully understand or appreciate the community's egalitarian principles. They tried to establish hierarchies based on how long they'd been there or how much land they worked. A few men objected to women having equal say in decisions. There were proposals to establish a more formal government structure, with elected leaders who had actual authority. The debate came to a head during a community meeting in late fall of the 5th year. Samuel Garrett, who'd become one of the valley's most respected voices, stood before the gathered residents and made an impassioned speech about the need for structure, for clear leadership, for someone to make final decisions when consensus couldn't be reached. "We can't keep growing without organization," he argued. "We need someone in charge, someone people can look to. And I think that person should be Eliza. She's been here from the beginning. She knows this valley better than anyone. We should formalize what's already happening and make her our leader." There were murmurs of agreement from some, but Eliza felt her stomach clench. This was exactly what she'd been trying to avoid. The concentration of power, the creation of the same hierarchies they'd all escaped. She stood, and the hall fell silent. "I appreciate the trust," she said carefully. "But no, that's not what we built here. We left places where one person or a small group made all the decisions, and everyone else had to live with the consequences. We came here specifically to create something different. The moment we establish formal leadership, we start down the path toward what we left behind." "But we need someone to make decisions," a newer resident argued. "We can't debate everything forever." "We don't debate everything forever. We talk until we find consensus. And when we can't find consensus, we experiment with different approaches and see what works." Eliza looked around the hall, meeting eyes. "Yes, it's slower. Yes, it's messier. But it's also more resilient. If we put all our faith in one leader, what happens when that leader makes a bad decision? What happens when they die or leave? We've built something stronger than that. Something that doesn't depend on any single person." Kyle stood beside her. "Eliza's right, and I'll add this. Every one of us came here because we were failed by people in power, people who valued their own interests over ours. The only way to prevent that from happening again is to make sure power stays distributed, that everyone has a voice, that no one person can make decisions that affect everyone else without their input." The debate continued for hours, voices rising and falling, arguments made and countered. But slowly, the tide shifted. People remembered why they'd come to the valley in the first place. They recognized that what made their community special was precisely its lack of formal hierarchy. By the end of the night, the proposal for formal leadership was rejected. Instead, they agreed to establish rotating facilitation roles, people who would help organize meetings and ensure everyone was heard, but who had no actual authority to make decisions unilaterally. The position would rotate monthly, ensuring no one person could accumulate too much influence. It wasn't perfect, but it was a solution they'd reached together, and that mattered more than perfection. As people filed out of the meeting hall, Samuel approached Eliza and Kyle. "I'm sorry, I thought I was helping, but I see now I was trying to recreate what I knew instead of embracing what we've built." "Don't apologize," Eliza said. "We needed to have this conversation. We'll probably need to have it again, every time we grow and change. That's okay. That's how we keep ourselves honest." The years accumulated like snowfall, each one adding to what came before, creating something beautiful and fragile and surprisingly strong. The valley became known throughout the territory as a place of refuge, though its exact location remained somewhat mysterious, shared only through trusted channels. People arrived with stories of violence escaped, poverty fled, oppression overcome. Not all of them stayed. Some found that the community's expectations of mutual contribution weren't what they wanted, or that they preferred the familiarity of traditional structures. But those who stayed became part of something larger than themselves. Eliza and Kyle's cabin remained the original structure at the heart of the settlement, though it had been expanded and improved over the years. They'd added a second room, then a covered porch, then a workshop where Kyle could repair tools and Eliza could work on projects that required space. The cabin had become a symbol of sorts, a reminder that everything they'd built had started with two people who refused to accept the world as it was and chose to create something better. On the 10th anniversary of their arrival in the valley, the community threw a celebration. There was food from the harvest, vegetables, grain, preserved meat, fresh bread. Someone had made beer from barley they'd grown themselves. Children ran through the gathering while adults talked and laughed and told stories about how far they'd come. Eliza stood slightly apart from the celebration, watching it all with a mixture of pride and disbelief. A decade ago, she'd been standing in front of her father's house in Red Hollow, alone and desperate and certain she was going to die. Now she was surrounded by a community of 87 people who'd chosen to build a life based on mutual support and respect. "Thinking profound thoughts?" Kyle asked, materializing beside her the way he still sometimes did, moving with a silence that years of domestic life hadn't quite erased. "Thinking about how strange life is, how the worst moments can lead to the best outcomes if you're willing to fight for them." "Philosophical." "Well, I'm old now, 10 years older than when we met. I'm allowed to be philosophical." Kyle laughed. "You're 33, hardly ancient. Ancient enough to appreciate what we've built here. Ancient enough to know how rare it is." He pulled her close, and they stood together watching their community celebrate. Eliza thought about the woman she'd been, the one who'd broken Thomas Carr's nose rather than submit to his presumptions. That defiance had nearly gotten her killed, but it had also led her here, to this valley, to this life, to this man who'd seen her as a person worth saving rather than a problem to be solved. "Do you ever wonder," she said quietly, "what would have happened if you'd just done what Silas paid you to do? Every day for the first year. Less now. But sometimes, yeah." "What do you think would have happened?" Kyle was quiet for a moment. "I think you would have fought me every step of the way. I think eventually I would have had to make a choice between completing the job and staying human. And I hope, I would have made the same choice I made in your yard that first day. Because the alternative is a version of myself I don't want to imagine. You would have killed me. Maybe. Or I would have left you somewhere remote and told Silas you were dead. Or I would have..." He shook his head. "There's no point in wondering. I made the choice I made. Everything else is just ghosts. Good ghosts or bad ghosts? Does it matter? They're not real. This is real." He gestured at the celebration, at the valley, at everything they'd created. "This is what matters." The celebration continued into the evening, and as darkness fell, someone built up the bonfire in the center of the settlement. People gathered around it, and one by one, they told their stories. How they'd found the valley, what they'd been running from, what they'd found here that they hadn't expected. When it was Eliza's turn, she stood before the fire and felt the weight of 87 pairs of eyes on her. She thought about what to say, how to encapsulate everything that had led to this moment. "I came here because I had nowhere else to go," she said finally, "because the town decided I was a problem that needed to be eliminated, and they hired someone to make me disappear. But the man they hired saw something they didn't, that I was a person, not a problem. That everyone deserves the chance to choose their own path, even when that path doesn't fit into neat categories or serve other people's interests." She looked at Kael, standing at the edge of the firelight. "We built this valley because we wanted a place where people could be different, and that would be okay. Where strength was measured not by how much you could take from others, but by how much you could give. Where community meant supporting each other rather than controlling each other. And I hope, we've succeeded in creating that." There was applause, but Eliza held up her hand. "But we can't take this for granted. Every day we have to choose to maintain what we've built, to resist the temptation to make things easier by concentrating power, to stay committed to consensus even when it's frustrating, to remember that we're all here because we refuse to accept that the only options were to conform or to suffer." She sat down, and others took their turns sharing. Each story was different, but they all shared common threads: rejection, escape, the search for something better. The fire burned late into the night, and when it finally died down to embers, people drifted back to their cabins with a sense of renewed purpose. Eliza and Kyle walked home through the settlement they'd built, past cabins where lights still burned and children slept safely, past the meeting hall where democracy happened messily but genuinely, past the fields that would feed them through another winter. 10 years, Kyle said, somehow both longer and shorter than it feels. Agreed. Some days it seems like we just arrived. Other days, I can barely remember what life was like before. They reached their cabin and went inside. The fire in the hearth had burned down, and Kyle built it back up while Eliza prepared tea from herbs they'd grown themselves. They settled into the chairs they'd built during that first winter, worn now, comfortable, perfectly fitted to their bodies. "What do you think the next 10 years will bring?" Eliza asked. "More of the same, hopefully. More growth, more people finding us, more challenges to work through." Kale sipped his tea. "Maybe some actual peace if we're lucky." "Peace sounds nice." "It does, though I'm not sure either of us would know what to do with it." Eliza laughed. "Probably not. We'd get bored and start some new project just to have something to struggle with." They sat in comfortable silence, the fire crackling, the valley quiet around them. Somewhere in the distance an owl called. The wind whispered through the pines. Life continued its ancient rhythms, indifferent to human drama, and somehow that was comforting. "Kael?" Eliza said after a while. "Yeah? Thank you. For seeing me when everyone else just saw a problem. For making a choice that changed both our lives. For building this with me." He reached over and took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. "Thank you for being worth the choice, for being stubborn enough to survive, for showing me what it means to actually live instead of just exist." They went to bed shortly after, lying together in the darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of their home. And as Eliza drifted toward sleep, she thought about the journey that had brought them here, the fear and desperation of those first days, the growing trust during their flight from Red Hollow, the tentative partnership that had become something deeper, more permanent, more real than any legal document could capture. She thought about her father, who taught her to stand straight even when the wind tried to push her down. He'd wanted her to be strong, to survive, to make her own way in a world that didn't make space for women like her. She hoped he could see what she'd built, hoped he'd be proud. Most of all, she hoped he'd approve of Kyle, this quiet, dangerous man who'd become her partner in every sense of the word, who'd learned to build instead of just track, to create instead of just destroy, to love instead of just survive. The years continued to pass, each one adding new chapters to the valley's story. A child was born, the first one conceived and raised entirely within the community. Then another, then several more. The school expanded to accommodate them. New traditions developed: harvest celebrations, winter solstice gatherings, spring planting ceremonies that had nothing to do with religion and everything to do with marking time and honoring the cycles that sustained them. Eliza's hair began to show silver threads. Kyle developed lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun during long days of outdoor work. They aged together, their bodies marked by years of labor, but also by the comfort of a life well lived. They never returned to Red Hollow, though they heard occasional news through traders. The town had indeed died, slowly and painfully, as its economic base collapsed and its population drifted away. The last anyone heard, there were fewer than 30 people still living there, clinging to the remnants of what had been. Silas Carr had died in prison, bitter and broken. Thomas had become a minor bureaucrat somewhere in the East, his name and legacy forgotten. The valley, meanwhile, thrived. By the 20th year, they had nearly 200 residents spread across multiple settlements within the larger territory they'd claimed. They'd established formal trade relationships with other communities, exchanging goods and knowledge. They'd become known as a place where innovative farming techniques were developed, where craftsmanship was valued, where people could speak their minds without fear of retribution. And through it all, Eliza and Cale remained at its heart, not as leaders exactly, but as living reminders of what the valley represented, proof that two people could refuse the world as it was and create something better. That strength came from standing together rather than standing above. That the best revenge against those who tried to break you was to build a life so full and rich and meaningful that they became irrelevant. On their 25th anniversary in the valley, Eliza stood once again at the doorway of their cabin, expanded now, refined, but still essentially the same structure they'd built with raw hands and desperate hope. She was 50 years old, her body marked by years of hard work and harder winters, but she'd never felt stronger. Cale came to stand beside her, his hair more silver than dark now, his movements still graceful, but slower, more deliberate. They looked out at the valley they'd created, at the community that had grown from two refugees into something that would outlast them both. "Worth it?" Cale asked, the question he'd posed many times over the years. "Every moment," Eliza answered, the response that had never changed. They'd started with nothing but defiance and determination. They'd built an empire not of wealth or power, but of community and choice, and the radical idea that people deserved better than what the world was offering. They'd proven that the woman a town wanted gone, and the man hired to make her disappear, could instead create something that mattered more than either of them ever could alone. And as the sun set over the valley, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Eliza Crow stood beside Cale Varick and knew with absolute certainty that they'd won. Not by defeating their enemies, though they'd done that too, but by refusing to let those enemies define them, by choosing to build instead of destroy, to create instead of comply, to love instead of fear. The wilderness that had once threatened them had become their kingdom. The marriage forged in desperation had become the foundation of everything they'd created. And the two people the world had tried to break had instead rewritten their fate, built something stronger than any town could ever take, and proved that sometimes the best victories are the ones that outlive you. Their story became legend in the territories, the tale of the woman who wouldn't bend and the tracker who chose mercy over money. Children grew up hearing it, using it as inspiration for their own acts of defiance and creation. And though the details shifted with each retelling, the core remained true. Two people, one choice, a lifetime of consequences that changed everything. And in the end, that was enough, more than enough. It was everything.